This video is going to cover Unit 1, Lesson 4, Example 9. Example 9 puts together a lot of our different transformations for our sine and cosine graphs. The first thing you need to do when you look at r of x in its original form, the one that's on your notes packet, is realize that there's both a b value and an h value. So there's a value that is being multiplied by x, and there's also a value that's being added or subtracted to the x value. So whenever that happens, whenever we're kind of messing with the input in these two different ways, we need to factor before we do anything else. So you can see in the second line, I'm going to factor out whatever is being multiplied by x. So I factored out the 1/2, and just think backwards. If you were to redistribute, make sure that the value you've written in here will give you the value above. So if I factor out the 1/2, inside my next set of parentheses, I get x plus pi. And again, this is only something you have to worry about if you have both a horizontal shift as well as a value that's going to impact the period. So let's go ahead and talk about the different pieces we see on r of x. The first thing I'm going to notice is that there is a change in the amplitude. The value that's being multiplied by the trig function is 4, and so the amplitude of our graph will be 4. The next thing I'm going to look at as I move across here is that 1/2 and how it's going to impact the period. So I'm going to take the period of the parent function, just regular cosine, which is 2 pi, divide it by 1/2 to get 4 pi. So remember that 1/2 means that the curve travels half as fast, so it will take an entire 4 pi to get one complete period. For the other pieces, we know that this plus pi, again after I've factored it, is going to tell us to start, and I put that in quotations since our graph technically doesn't have a start or an end, but we're going to start at negative pi on the x-axis. And lastly, this minus 2 at the end will tell us we have a vertical shift down 2. So that's going to be our new midline. So after we've identified what the different transformations will do to our graph, we can start labeling our axes. I like to label the x-axis first because that is generally the more difficult one, so it just kind of gets it out of the way. So I need to think of a couple things. First, with the period of 4 pi, remember that we'll always break the period into fourths to represent kind of the 4 quadrants, so to speak. And so we know that we're going to count by pi's. I also know that we had this horizontal shift to the left pi, so we're going to quote-unquote start at negative pi on our x-axis. From there, if I'm counting by pi's, as we just figured out here, then I know that my next mark will be at 0, my next kind of critical value for this graph. After that, we'll be at pi, 2 pi, and then 3 pi. So I always label at least 5 points on the x-axis. If you notice, going from negative pi to 3 pi is a distance of 4 pi, so that's going to complete one full period. The next thing I'll do is go ahead and label the y-axis. So this negative 2 again shifts the midline down 2. So at negative 2 on the y-axis, I'm just going to put a bit of a dotted line there that's kind of like my new x-axis. I'm going to think of that as the center of the graph. From the midline, I'm going to travel the distance both up and down of the amplitude of that 4 that's in front of the cosine. So if I'm at negative 2 and I travel up 4 spaces, it'll give me a maximum value of 2, positive 2. And if I travel down 4 spaces, it gives me a minimum of negative 6. See if I can make that a little darker for you. So I know my graph will be bounded at positive 2 and negative 6 in the y direction, and it's going to kind of start at negative pi in the x direction and end at 3 pi. So we're going to fit one period of a cosine curve into that space. We know that cosine, and it's not a negative cosine graph, it's just a regular positive cosine graph because that's a positive 4. Cosine starts at a maximum, ends at a maximum, has a minimum value halfway through, and then on the kind of quarter points, it touches the midline. So remember, we have a new midline different from the x-axis. I will complete the picture, and after that you can see how these other pieces are filled in that we hadn't done previously. So the period and amplitude were done ahead of time. You probably could have filled in the domain as well. Now that I have the y-axis labeled, I can fill in the range. And for the zeros, I just put a smiley face because it's not that there aren't any zeros. We can definitely see where our curve crosses the x-axis, but they're very difficult to find. We'd have to use technology to assist us in that. So I don't want you to write no zeros since they do occur, but I don't want you to worry about having to find these zeros when they don't fall on one of our 5 points that we labeled our axis with. And that's all I have for you today.